There we go. Well, hello. We always have a bit of a shaky beginning, Aspasia, but welcome to the Untold Radio Network. My name's Jay Katz. Of course, this is my wife, Aspasia, and I think we might be getting a little bit of echo from our guest today, the extraordinary Matt Pohl, who's here for Reframing Indigenous Law. And Matt is a curator at the National Maritime Museum in Sydney.
That's right.
And we're coming to you from Sydney, Australia.
We are.
And can we just check that sound of yours, Matt? I think we might be getting just a little bit of feedback.
Are your headphones?
There we go. I think we're clearing that. No, we can't hear you now.
Now we can't hear you.
So maybe you're... Oh, that's better.
No, hang on. That was us, wasn't it?
Is that working okay?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
That's good.
Oh, good. Sorry, I took it off the speaker. I didn't realize that was coming back.
Yeah. We're getting a bit of feedback.
All right, Matt, can you just tell us a little about your curatorial position at the National Maritime Museum and your history? I believe it was over a decade at Sydney University as a programmer and curator there.
Yeah, look, I've worked for more than 25 years, been very fortunate to work in museums and galleries in Australia. My background is Torres Strait, South Sea Islander, so I've always been sort of attached to the coastlines and stories about that. I grew up in Byron Bay, New South Wales, most easterly point on the Australian mainland. But a lot of my work over the years has been working with older anthropological collections, whereas my new position with the National Maritime Museum is a nationally focused museum where we get to explore all the different regions of Australia, all the coastlines, rivers, stories of the sea. I do a lot of engagement. So most of my work is actually looking at collections that we have, talking to community members and finding out the real stories behind those objects and things that we hold in our archives and in our collections, and trying to reinterpret what those older histories are through the lens of modern Indigenous people's perspectives.
And which is, I'd say, an incredible problem to surmount because we have so much disinformation in our history. Can you go back and maybe take us to the beginning of white settlement in Australia and some of the misnomers that as white Australians we all have? Because I don't think many of us realise that at some point here that the white settlers initially, even with Tasmania, started to call this terra nullius, as if there was no Indigenous race on this continent. And it is probably now, from an archaeological perspective, being seen as one of the oldest, if not the oldest and most profound race to be on this planet.
That's the incredible thing. Aboriginal culture was the last contacted and, left off the world maps until it was, in 1770, 1788, brought into the world consciousness. And then for more than 200 years, you had so much Aboriginal history, which was authored by non-Indigenous people. And so it's only really in the last couple of decades that this new story of the Aboriginal past, told by the oral traditions that were preserved by Aboriginal people themselves, has been slowly coming to the light, and it's just overturned so much of what was thought about Aboriginal culture. The dangerous stereotypes, the caricatures, the general just misinformation that the colonial enterprise and missionaries who were very determined to stamp out what they called primitive and heathen cultures. It's left this legacy of a version of the Aboriginal past which is not accurate. And it's one of the most astounding and beautiful cultures in the world. The animism, totemism, the stories that people have, how they, not only survived but thrived, across 300 what we know as distinct groups across the country. And when you start to explore the law, the story, the history from that perspective, it's just astounding. Every day I'm learning something new. I mean, we think, in museums we know a lot, but, it's only really when you talk to the real people, the real knowledge holders, the people who practice ceremony, the people who are still intricately connected to their country, that we just start to, break apart all these sort of older, unhelpful stories about the past and learn this just beautiful new mosaic of knowledge that's out there that's just waiting to be explored.
And it's knowledge that can be extraordinarily beneficial to all of us, because here you have a culture of a multiplicity of tribal communities that appeared to live in complete harmony with the landscape itself.
They talk about the land as an ancestor, and they're not joking. I mean, this is the land, the land is a relative of theirs. When you see some of the stories about, crocodiles as ancestral beings or sharks as ancestral beings, as different versions of humans, older versions of humans that live contemporaneous with people today, you start to see these incredible connections to, the connections to country, sea country, to, not just through the animal kingdom, but through plants and through weather phenomena. And just, it's a remarkable way of, for us as modern people to learn from and to just understand our world better.
And I think with all the climate issues we're facing, we can see in a short amount of time that by terraforming the landmass we're on, the damage that we've done. And it might be part of a misnomer to do with our First Nation culture, but they appear to be a culture that didn't really do a lot of terraforming. They accepted the land for what it was. And as you said before, the concept of Gaia seems to be something they've held close. That nature is a living being that has to be respected, and you work again within harmony in that notion. So I think it's probably really important that we do something that's done at most live events in Sydney now and throughout the nation to start to slowly change. And I admit it's baby steps, but we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And tell us about the traditional owners of this land that we're broadcasting from here in Sydney, the Gadigal people. Can you tell us about them?
Eora Nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, we know from all sorts of sources that for more than 20,000 years, these great intergenerational migrations of people spread all along the east coast of Australia. I mean, this is a time when Tasmania was still connected to the mainland. And the Eora Nation is actually a hub in the ancient world, I'm pretty sure. It has the largest outdoor rock engraving gallery on the whole east coast of Australia. It's no surprise that the city of Sydney is built on what was this in remarkable location. Those thousands of rock engravings are just a complete mythology that was just not recorded at the time. It's astounding that it actually survived. There's hundreds of those rock engravings which were destroyed through the gradual expansion of Sydney itself. But they're still powerful places. When you talk to Eora community members, they say when you're approaching a rock art site, you're approaching sacred ground. And these rock engravings have things like astronomical knowledges. More than 50% of them are of marine creatures. There's this view of the world that is still there if you care to see it and care to be guided by people to how to look at it.
So I've just popped up an engraving of
Wangina
in the Kimberleys.
Yeah.
That's survived.
And we've seen recently the notion of fracking and, some of that original art being destroyed and decimated, even still today with the knowledge in the public domain.
That's on the exact same same longitude on the west coast of Australia, the Burrup Peninsula. Another 30,000 rock engravings, some of the oldest depictions of the human face, which predate even those Wangina paintings that you see there. Some of them are they say they're 30,000 years old because that's the limits of the type of testing that they were doing to try and work out how old they are. They're very likely older, and they're signs of these massive cultural complexes which existed at different times and which were, because of climate change in the past, forced people to move to different parts of the country and then come back and then move again. In some ways, many of the nations that we know today were the original victims of climate change, as sea levels rose and there's different things. And, we know that there was a great inundation on the south coast of New South Wales, for example. the culture was never static. People were moving. People were making huge migrationary paths, whether individuals or as intergenerational paths across the country. And that's the song lines that still are unbroken and are still crisscrossing the nation and connecting, like, many of those hundreds of Aboriginal nations too.
And how many nations are we talking about? How many different tribes are out there? Are we aware of the complexity, the multiplicity of this?
I guess the snapshot of that and the original language map was only really put together by the 1960s or so, based on hundreds of different sources of information. So it's not a perfect map, but it's a snapshot of at least 300 distinct languages. I mean, a lot of those languages share words, there's actual relationships between the groups. But when you have a sense of how vast the Australian continent is and how people adapted to all the different environments, from the sea country up north to the snowy country in southeastern Australia to the deserts in central Australia, even to the temperate zones in the south, you start to get an understanding of how people needed that relationship to the land to survive, and they needed to be able to experientially read the landscape, as being a part of it. And none of this was written down in the same tools that we use these days, or that we take for granted with like computers and things like that. This was a history and a knowledge and a lore that was preserved in songs. It was preserved in performance. It was preserved in telling stories about astronomical phenomena in the sky, for example. That oral history aspect of Aboriginal culture is so important, and it's been so important to actually preserve that in the current day, which is why, we have had this artistic renaissance that's happened in Australia since the 70s, when Aboriginal people themselves, built their own dance companies, film companies, literature, all different things like that. So it's a gradual process, and that that impact of colonization, they were hit so hard. It's just a testament to the strength and resilience of their culture that they've found the space to really articulate themselves on their own terms in this era that we're living in now.
And I believe that the missionary aspect to colonization in many ways tried to replace that incredible long oral history. And as you were saying initially, saw it as something heathen, something demonic, and something dark and needed to be pushed away. How do you preserve with such sort of fascistic forces around you? How do you preserve that extraordinary history?
Well, I think it preserves itself in a sense, because when you really understand some of the deeper creation mythologies and things like that, they're telling us about relationship to the land and the nurturing of the land in a way that the land nurtures people. We keep coming. We're sort of turning this point at the moment where things like fire stick farming and different sort of
Explain that
ways.
to us, Matt. Sorry to interrupt you, but explain to us what fire stick farming is.
Well, one of the things that the missionaries did when they sort of took people's connection away to the land and put them on missions and reserves, for example, was broke their agricultural methods of dealing with the land. It wasn't the Western European farm where things are sectioned off into different sections. The whole, hundreds of kilometers that people lived within was treated as a landscape. And this concept of wilderness is an entirely modern fabrication. People did, nurture the land through things like fire, and shaped it in some sort of ways by having this really close relationship to it. And it's, because we had these massive bushfires since 2019, for example, people are understanding that you don't just let things chaotically grow like, bush wilderness, like it needs to be managed in a sense like that. So these knowledges that are embedded in that oral history about what to do at different seasons of the year, when to hunt particular animals at different times of the year, are all coming back to us as ways of actually connecting and preserving our relationship with the environment that we live in.
It's interesting you've stated that, because I can remember rolling into the Pillager Scrub to talk to a whole group of shearers. And, for those people internationally that are unaware of what shearing is, it's taking the wool off lambs. But these were tenacious, hard guys that thought I was just another greenie. And I went up there to ask them stories about Australia's version of Bigfoot, the Yowie. And they told me that, that shrubland is so dense. It's so extraordinarily dense that something could have hid out there for years. And then later on, I realized there was only colonization that let that shrubland grow into that dense level, that the indigenous population were well aware of working within that shrubland to keep it down through the use of fire. And that's how they would get their food sources. So this was a completely new mythology based on colonization that had actually embedded itself. And I think this is one of the saddest things, the way that semantics works against us in terms of Western thinking. And we use words to denigrate profound cultures that are probably much wiser in the use of their land than we will ever be. And things like primitives and natives, those words are so denigrating.
That's an interesting, you mentioned that, like the Yowie, or what they call in the south coast of New South Wales, Doolagar, the hairy men. There's stories of that in many different places all along the east coast of Australia. And when I've gone out to do like consultation projects and things like that, there's certain places of country people still won't go. Those pockets are still there in that sense. And the stories that people told, aren't that fictional in that sense, because you do get this eerie atmospheric sense when you're visiting some of these places. And, that's what the acknowledgement of country is about. It's asking the land to protect you as you walk on it. You don't just stomp all over it like you own the place. You actually, ask for protection, as part of an acknowledgement of country when you enter somebody else's country. So these traditions, which are still being preserved and brought out today, are, warding against those ways of not seeing country.
And I mean, too, I'd like to speak to you about the adoption of Indigenous languages into English through colonization.
Words.
Yeah, I mean, here in Sydney, I think it's about 35, 40 Ks away, there is a Yowie Bay. It's actually stated. And look, just let me digress a little bit on that notion. Jane Goodall, one of the world's leading primatologists, when asked about the notion of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the multiplicity of words used for this parallel hominid on the planet, she makes the statement as, how can we deny Indigenous history right across
Indigenous knowledge
across the globe? And they seem to have a respectful, deeply acknowledged relationship with this parallel species, and that there are structures that they will find and noises that they will hear that tell you that you are now stepping into a sacred area and it's best to leave that area alone. Just recanting basically those words you were speaking about before. And so this, again, is where semantics comes into play, and these things are called folklore or mythology, and they don't realize the deep understanding and respect there for these alternate life forms that are elusive to man in the 21st century, humanity, I should say. But in many ways, the evidence shows that they are still predominantly part of our landscape.
Aboriginal knowledges have preserved all things like that. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago that they found the remains of Homo florensis, the hobbit, the 5 foot tall sort of humanoid people that were living off the islands of Indonesia. There's stories from Queensland of a sort of a pygmy race of people living among the other Aboriginal people. It's just, it's horrifying to think how some of those people were massacred, and the diversity of human species across Australia. I mean, the Denisovans is another one that they found markers of in the South Pacific and in Siberia. It wasn't just humans and Neanderthals. I think they're up to about 2 at least different types of human who were living concurrent with Homo sapiens. And so what else is sort of we still yet to be uncovered? I think a lot of that knowledge is actually preserved in Aboriginal stories. I mean, people rehear them the first times and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense. But then the more and more that you sort of see some of these scientific breakthroughs or anthropology breakthroughs and different things, it's like, wait a minute, there's actually it's much more, these Aboriginal stories are truer than the ones that we've told ourselves for so long.
And it's only history that's going to prove that more and more. Can you tell us about this notion of like, something incredibly unique about our First Nations culture is they didn't seem to leave, well, as far as I'm aware, but I've found out things a little more recently that to the contrary of that, they didn't seem to build any artifices or of course there was rock art, but were there structures? Were there mounted stones? Were there things like that that were removed by the colonists that were suppressed, that history?
For sure, it's only with the modern LiDAR and satellite technology that we're seeing things like the big cultural complex in Budj Bim in Western Victoria, for example. These watercourses that were channeled and specifically sectioned off to breed eels and different things like that. The architecture was a bit makeshift. I mean, people would move at different seasons of the year to different parts of country, either for ceremony or because that's where it's easier to harvest resources and different things like that. So you do find, those rock paintings and the cave structures, especially in places like the Blue Mountains and things like that. That's where so much of that evidence is sort of preserved. But, when you look at the strata in those caves and things like that, people lived there for very short times, multiple times over thousands of years.
Now, from an archaeological perspective, we are still coming across, skeleton forms that make us realize that our Indigenous culture is extremely old. Where are we at today in terms of the timeline?
Well, you'll meet Aboriginal people that'll tell you that they've always been here. And sometimes it seems like that's where we're sort of going. Some of the oldest evidence archaeologically is like a 65,000-year-old site in northern Australia. But the other thing to keep in mind is the shape of the modern continent of Australia is only really 15 to 25,000 years old. Aboriginal people have been living here before the great sea level rises that happened. So there's so much evidence literally buried under the sea along so many different parts. I mean, I've seen research, there's around 20 different places around the country where oral histories have preserved knowledges of sea level rise. Port Phillip Bay in Victoria, the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And so, yeah, one of the reasons when people say they can't see evidence of where people lived 60,000 years ago or 80,000 years ago is because it's all been covered up by the sea. So, we need to be much more advanced in things like underwater archaeology and recognizing geologic sort of shapes along coastlines and things like that, which are sort of submerged under the sea. And I think that's where we're going to see some of the more incredible, exciting discoveries over the next couple of decades. They've already found one in Western Australia, which is about 2 kilometers out to sea, where at Murujuga, where stone tool artifacts and there's a space where people were living, more than 12,000 years ago, has actually been covered up by the sea level rise.
Now, this notion too, I mean, recently, within the last 5 years, Eric von Daniken, the author of Chariots of the Gods, came out here and looked at what was to believe the remnants in New South Wales of standing stones, similar,
a Stonehenge, yeah.
like a Stonehenge. Are you aware of that structure?
Yeah, that's up near where I grew up in the north coast of New South Wales. And look, there's several of those really. They're clearly, like the one I know from Western Victoria that's near Budj Bim is actually an astronomical calendar. So those ones that are still sort of remnants are still existing there and thankfully have been preserved, not destroyed by the agricultural and pastoral expansion in so many places. I think are waiting to tell their story. I think one thing I've learned working so much with community members over the times that knowledge reveals itself at, when it's the right time to know it. If you try and seek it too early, you're asking for trouble.
And there needs to be that foundation stone there with knowledge. And unfortunately, that foundation stone has been corrupted by white colonization. So
there is a particular set of rocks that were actually dismantled. Do you know that one?
I think that's what you were
Is that the one you were
speaking
talking about? That was actively dismantled by the authorities and gotten rid of. And one of the main, it was a carving of some sort of an animal, was actually shipped off to some other country somewhere.
Oh, look, I know I know that one, but there's the most heartbreaking one is there was actually a meteorite in Victoria, just outside the Melbourne area, which was an incredibly sacred spot where people would gather and, have very important ceremonies. The meteorite was dug out of the ground. It was put into a museum in the US. And the stories at the time of Aboriginal people just wailing, like, what are you doing taking this meteorite from our country? They preserved in their stories. And there's at least 3 sites across the country where knowledge of meteorite landings have been preserved through oral traditions. There's one just a bit south of Alice Springs, the Henbury meteorite crater, and those meteorite fragments are held in museums all around the world. But if you listen to the oral history, they talk about this fire devil living in the water, which is from when the water was radioactive from the meteorite, and it's preserved there. So yeah, that shifting of, what was, science was looking for meteorites, but when they take them out of their cultural context, they completely destroyed this deeper knowledge complex which was associated with all those type of objects.
Now, I know that is some direct work that you've been involved in. This is going to be a 2-tier question, because I find, how do we actually go back and get these sacred artifacts
back,
and the destruction that can be caused by removing them, not only philosophically, emotionally, but things we may be completely unaware of in our modern context that exert some sense of harmony on the land. And the other thing is, I believe that only recently in archaeology has the term astroarchaeology been coined, because now archaeologists are beginning to realize the massive understanding of astronomy that these supposedly primitive cultures have.
Had.
And excuse our cat who's got a little bit of Come on.
The astro-botanical connections, for sure. I've seen some incredible connections about that. When different plants are flowering at different types of the year, they perfectly align with different astronomical phenomena. That's the big rock engraving site that's in Guringai National Park, for example. It's a picture of an emu engraved in the sandstone.
Wow.
It has an egg inside it, and every September it perfectly aligns with the Milky Way, which is September is the time of year when emus are laying their eggs. So it's an astronomical calendar, in the shape of an engraving of an emu. And like when you stand in front of it, you see the emu shape inside the Milky Way as well. I mean, who knows what else the story about that, what information it contained. All we have is this scraps and fragments of information about that connection of, the Milky Way and the September time of year when it perfectly aligns, and that being the time when emus are laying their eggs too. So, I mean, there's this beautiful connection to the sky worlds, to the knowledges of the ocean, of this deep, since time immemorial, really, connection to the land that, once you know one part of the story, it starts to unlock the intersections with the other knowledges and stories too.
And we see that in Indigenous cultures throughout the world, especially when it comes to the notion of creation myths and the way that white culture has homogenized those myths into a very sellable product. But there is a similarity throughout all cultures. And so, I mean, a similarity with your culture in Greece in terms of the creation and the flood and all those ideas. Maybe tell us a little bit about the rainbow serpent and the creation myths to do with our Indigenous here in Australia.
Well, The amazing thing is that so many of them come from the sea, and it's that serpent motif that comes back time and time again. There's several versions of the rainbow serpent. Sometimes it's mountain ranges, sometimes it's carving out rivers. I mean, there's a beautiful one off the northern western coast of Australia near where the Wandjina are, which is island goon. And it's a big serpent that lives out in the ocean, and its scales fall off and turn into the pearl shells, which wash up onto the shore, which people use to make these beautiful adornments on and things like that. Serpent mythology. And, you know, when you see different types, you know, they have that little rainbow reflection in them too. They were very sacred, but also very profound type of animals in that sense. People who have snake totems, for example, are very, very grounded in law, ceremony, and culture. So yeah, I think you could point to probably 50 different parts across the country where there's different alternate versions of that same mythology about the serpent. You know, even the way that rainbows, you know, after the storms look like serpents in the sky. I mean, you know, sometimes it's, you know, the serpent isn't even there. It's things like weather phenomena where they're seeing the rainbow serpent express itself as a rainbow. It's just this incredible worldview where you start to sort of understand, you know, where the creator spirit is living.
I was going to say that it doesn't matter how maligned you know, snakes are, that they crop up in all cultures, in their creation myths, no matter what. Even in Christianity, you've got the serpent, you know, right there, you know, in the Garden of Eden, you know,
Yeah.
manipulating, you know, humankind into doing what he wanted them to do. So it's really bizarre that in all the cultures,
Medical iconography.
well, you know, it's just there in everything, and it's there for a reason. It's not just, you know, all these different cultures separated by time and distance, you know, that they've all got this same motifs coming up over and over again.
Oh, serpents and reptiles. I mean, a lot
Yeah.
of those rock engravings and other things they've seen, they're hybrid people, you know,
Mm.
amorphous. They have both serpent or reptile or fish features as well as their human bodies. It's not about a relationship. There's something very deep going on there in the way that people are, you know, wanting to preserve this knowledge for future generations about these deep ancestral relationships. That's like the ones with crocodiles as well. I mean, some of those skin scarring techniques that you see are to make their skin look like crocodile skin.
Yeah.
You know, people are, you know, embodying these deeper relationships with all sorts of, you know, the marsupials and mammals across Australia, not to mention remembering things like the megafauna, which they lived concurrently with. You know, the rainbow serpent there is megafauna of giant snakes. I mean, you know, the size of cars type thing, you know, across the Australian mainland. I mean, to think encountering something like that is something that's worth telling a story about, and probably why those stories persist still today. The giant wombats, there's like the giant version of the Tasmanian tiger. I mean, you know, there was a emu that was like, you know, more than 8 feet tall, which is preserved in rock paintings up in the Kimberley region. That world that Aboriginal people lived amongst with the megafauna is sort of where you see that intersection with some of these the modern cryptozoological creatures, which are still sort of, you know, in rivers or in the oceans or, you know, living amongst the trees and the mountains and things like that.
Do you want to talk about the bunyip, which is one of those?
And the bunyip's something that really like has disappeared from our language in a way in the last 100 years. But this was something that the original colonists spoke about extensively, and we're looking at an adaptation there on one of Australia's postage stamps.
So can you tell us about the bunyip and what its story is?
Yeah, that's the one that's part reptile, part human. Found mostly around swampy areas. Just natural guardians of places that people weren't meant to go. You find them especially down along the mountainous sort of areas of the Great Dividing Range along the east coast of Australia. There's several different versions of that, and they're absolutely spooky. You know, sometimes they sort of walk like horses on all four. Other times they're standing up on their back legs. There's, yeah, a different sort of mythology around all those sort of ones, which was completely overwritten by, you know, the Australian bunyip myth.
Yeah.
Even like the first guy who recorded the stories of the bunyip was a bit of a charlatan. He actually had a cycloptic horse, which he found a skull of, and he was selling tickets to see it in Sydney. You know, and it's completely, he attached that bunyip myth to it, saying, oh, I found a bunyip skull. And then everybody scoffed at bunyips for like 150 years after that, because, you know, of the, you know, the charlatan type thing that he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's one of those things where people sort of tease you as something really tantalizing, but then misdirect you with all this other sort of, you know, different version of that history, when we should have been listening to the true custodians of that story since day one.
That's why it's so important to go back and to preserve this extraordinary rich multiplicity of oral history. When you were speaking before about that creative notion, I mean, the last bastion of spirituality I think we've got left in the West is our creativity, but so much of it now is being turned into commodity and product, and what you were saying before becomes part of exploitation. But if we were to think that there could be a shamanic quality still lying dormant within us, the only way to actually exercise that shaman is through the creative process. And it looks to me as if our Indigenous culture always knew that, and their creativity wasn't just purely for design or something that was, you know, transitory. It was there to mark history and mark that profound relationship with everything that is alive, or even everything that just exists. And so the relationship there, I think, is really important for us to begin to understand that this is not just one single living oddity, that there is a gigantic relationship, and so much of it is sacred and needs to be respected in that way. And then I'm just going to jump quickly to this notion of like the hybrid, something we hear in UFO history, the short history, especially to do with abductions, is the amount of people believing that there's some hybridization program in existence. And through the decades of research we've done, we've actually seen reasonable evidence to say that that could be a possibility. So maybe, I don't know if you can speak about that in terms of like the relationship with our Indigenous culture with the beings from outside, from the stars, the light beings, maybe the Min, whatever.
Yeah, look, those stories of the sky world are really interesting in that ways. It's an afterworld, and but it's also a place where people come back. If you look at the stories of the Morning Star up in North, for example, or ways that people, or, you know, a lot of those incredible dot paintings that you see, which are so emblematic of Aboriginal art, they're actually read the same way that you would read astrological phenomena. And, you know, the same sort of as Western astrology, for example, there's all myths built into the way that you interpret them. But I mean, I've seen some amazing stories. There's a mountain on the south coast of New South Wales where there's this great ladder that forms, and the sky people at their end of their lives climb up the ladder. But also, if you don't do the proper mortuary ceremony, people start climbing down the ladder and coming back. And so that's why there's so many really significant mortuary practices, because it's all about that pathway that people take in the afterlife. And if you don't practice law properly and practice ceremonial culture properly, you open your community up to this huge danger, essentially, of, you know, that spirit world re-entering. I mean, that's the other reason why we have that prohibition in Australia about saying Aboriginal. We know that warning we have with the different TV shows, like,
yes,
you know, Aboriginal, this film may show deceased people. because there's certain people in the community who, if they see that person's image after they've passed away, they can bring that person back. And that person hangs around them and different things. I mean,
so it's like ghost hauntings.
Yeah, that world. I mean, in the Aboriginal world, that's why ceremony is so important. I mean, some mortuary practices go on for like 3 weeks or even more, or things like that. There's a very strong cycle for significant members of the community to see them safely off into that journey as well, and also protect the people that are still here.
Right, so they can't come back.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that, that's there in mariculture in New Zealand with the marae. And also, here's one of the biggest problems, I think, and I'm generalizing, but speaking of Western culture, is that we sort of hide death. We push it to one side. And when it finally appears in our lives, we're devastated. We suffer post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. You have a culture here that embraces it. And so many Indigenous cultures do that. And it's not just that individual that's mourning their partner, it's the entire family, it's the entire community, and that respect for that individual. And I guess the other question I'm going to ask is about our perpetual earthlight phenomena, which we call the Min light in this country, and of course over in America they have the Martha lights. And then initially the settlers would call them spook lights, as if they were spirits of the dead. Now, is the Min derived from Indigenous history as a spirit light?
It would exactly be like that sort of thing that we were just talking about ancestors coming back. They're not coming back in human form. And there's actually positive examples where people come back. I mean, you do hear a lot of stories of people coming back in dreams. One of the most amazing stories from recent time was Mungo Man, that 41,000-year-old ancestor. And I loved the local Aboriginal community member because she said, she said to the archaeologist, you didn't find him. He came and found you because he had a message for our modern community about how long we've actually been here, And that's where Mungo is. That's on the edges of those deserts where, you see those phenomena like the Min lights and different things like that. So there's, when you see them, sometimes, it's not always a negative sense of things coming back. Sometimes things are coming back to people to give them messages, to help them through something dangerous which might be happening soon.
And I think, I think that's incredibly correct. And most people, when shocked, having a very close experience with the Min light, and Min lights can also transform themselves, shapeshift themselves into what appear to be classic UFO technology at times. And they're a very contradictory phenomenon. I've spent time on the Nullarbor with roo shooters who will one night see them in the equidistance, think it's a poacher on their land, stab it and steer it, and never get any closer all night long. Next night they go out, they're being dive bombed by these things. But they all feel that there is a close personal relationship with their interaction with this light. And that's where people's notion of consensus reality collapses. Because it's one thing to see something anomalous outside of your frame of reference and outside the cultural reference, but the next thing is to think that thing is actually
communicating with you
personally in one way or another.
Yeah, you're just standing on the side of the superhighway between the spiritual world and the real world, and you're seeing the flashing of the headlights, I think, if you wanted to think of it in that way, because whether it's not always a message for you, it's a message for someone else, and you're just standing in the pathway of that message as it's coming back.
It must be incredibly difficult for an individual like yourself that wants to preserve this culture. You're like a bridge over this troubled water. You're a bridge of the proletariat to the academic into those realms that sometimes seem so closed. How does someone like you keep going and survive across decades?
Look, I just think I was incredibly lucky when I was younger to listen to those older generation people who were telling me, look, you can, there's a fascinating pathway here, and I've actually been very lucky to work with artists over the years, and that's like links back to what you say with the creativity. Because when you see artists who are just in that zone where they're just making work that just defies logic about why would you even start with that, but the end result is something incredibly special that you wouldn't imagine. Because it's about, just learning and teaching, as well as just natural curiosity, I guess. But I learned from a very early age that the story of Aboriginal Australia was not told well, and it was not even told fairly in a sense. And you can point to a couple of really great things that have happened over the last couple of decades, but there's still a long way to go in terms of that equality and bringing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia back up onto that level playing field that we also all take for granted today as well. So,
I think we're very lucky to have you in the position you are in at the moment. Can you tell us what you're working on at the moment with the National Maritime Museum?
A couple of different things. I mean, it's a bit, one of the really projects I'm excited about is oyster reef rehabilitation. I mean, these are, we have around 10% of the existing oyster reefs along the coastlines of Australia. Yet these are places that sustained generations of people. When you look at the big middens, we have the middens, but we don't have the oyster reefs. I'm doing a big project in Broome next year, which I'm pretty excited about, which is about one of those positive stories. There's an artist up there who made 1,000 of these, what are called ilma, these geometric designs, basically, that tell different parts of a song cycle. And he was inspired to make those 1,000 ilma because his father came back to him in a dream after he had passed away and told him this really important story about when he was swept out to sea for 3 days. And it was only the song doing those dances related to those ilma that gave him the knowledge about, with wind directions and bird migrations and, how he could actually save himself from being swept far out to sea and found his way back to the coastline. We're also just working on our larger ongoing project, which is called Shaped by the Sea. And just the way the Indigenous knowledge and scientific perspectives of Australia's coastlines are actually coming up with the same conclusions constantly.
Now, people internationally listening to this podcast, if they want to come to Australia and go to this museum or even get in touch with you for some information, how can they do that?
Look, we can put that up in the notes to this podcast if that's okay. It's just the Australian National Maritime Museum. It's pretty easy to be out there. And for any international visitors, I'd always say, at the top of your list of to-do things, do some Aboriginal engagement. There's hundreds of great companies around the country. And when you actually sit down in country with an Aboriginal knowledge holder, you just experience that country so much differently than you would from the, Tourist Australia campaign version of visiting here with shrimps on the barbie and stuff. To really experience Australia, Aboriginal culture is the most Australian thing ever, so you need to put that at the top of your list in terms of just doing that little bit of legwork and background research about which regions you might be going to, and then finding out who are the knowledge holders or the artists or the places where Aboriginal people are choosing to engage with the outside world. Because I often find, international visitors are far more interested than the majority of Australians in a lot of this Aboriginal culture stuff that we work with. So, it's really interesting. And thanks to you guys for making it a topic of your show, I think, too. It's an excellent way of,
To us, Matt, it's probably the most important aspect of this show before people start listening to other stories and narratives, that we actually lay the groundwork, the most important foundation, and out of respect for the culture and respect for people like yourself. And one thing I've learned from you today that just keeps repeating all the time is that we need to respect our dreams. We need to actually look at our dreams very differently. Neurologists still can't tell us what the dream cycle in our life is about, but Indigenous cultures hold dreams as sacred moments of understanding the reality we're within. I mean, American Indian culture has the dream catcher. And so many people I know use that dream catcher in a very tokenistic way. But our Indigenous tribal cultures across this vast continent have always spoken about their oral history and the dream time. Maybe tell us what the dream time means.
Yeah, see, that's the perfect example of what we were saying before. Dreams are incredibly profound and significant, in so many different sort of elements that I've looked into around the country, whether it's knowledge coming back in a dream, whether it's, actual people alive in the world today or people from the spirit world who are telling you things that you really need to be listening to. I've definitely taken that on board in terms of actually really thinking more about my dreams based on some of the experiences I've had. I mean, one of the great artists, Rover Thomas, the Cyclone Tracy was going to happen. It came to him in a dream, and it was one of his relatives who died on a light plane because of Cyclone Tracy that kept coming back to him afterwards and saying, "Why didn't you warn everybody? We were telling you about Cyclone Tracy." And so that was a 70-year-old man who spent the last 15 years of his life just constantly painting the krill cycle, held in museums all around the world these days. But he didn't think of himself as an artist. He thought he didn't listen to that dream when he was first told about the warning of Cyclone Tracy coming. And Cyclone Tracy flattened Darwin, remember, in 1975. The entire city was pretty well just a write-off. It's taken them years to build back. But that was sparked by a dream, in that sense that, that when the artist made the works afterwards, he just could not stop putting that krill cycle about the warning that was given to him into his paintings. And they're some masterpieces of Australian art now.
Yeah, but he must realise, I mean, he realised later that even if he'd told everybody, how many people do you think would have listened to him,
No.
He's nuts, because most people don't believe that you can have a prophetic dream that's going to come true. You know what I mean? So you could have shouted it from every building in Darwin, and nobody would have listened to him. So
that's true.
you need to bring me and I'll tell him not to worry about it.
But there's good evidence out there. I mean, Rupert Sheldrake, the academic, has written about the morphogenic resonance, which is like Jung's notion of the mind at large. And I think that the way that the Indigenous respect everything that exists as part of Gaia is the way we should respect our consciousness, being part of a massive whole.
Yes.
And we're able to draw from that. Look, one of the elements of getting our client, I've just cut you off on something profound. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say Sigmund Freud, Totem and Taboo. That whole book has around 20 examples drawn from Aboriginal Australia and totemic affiliations. I mean, he was just looking at photographs from the other side of the world, but he was able to tap into how rich that spiritual connection to, totemic affiliation with animals, but also how, the dream world was coming back through our relationships with the world. And I could probably point to a few others. Durkheim was the same, who wrote the history and philosophy of religion. If you read their books, all the footnotes, Aboriginal Australia this or Aboriginal Australia that. There's, we need to learn our history so much better, because there have been important people throughout history who've signposted that way.
I think like Buckminster Fuller realised just before he invented the geodesic dome in his 30s that he had to literally go back and erase everything he'd learned, even the construction of sentences, to form new, clearer thoughts of what reality really was and is. One of our ways of fracturing the dream consciousness is by the exploitation in the world of media. And one of those great examples in the 60s drove me mad as a child, because everyone I asked about seeing this short mini-series on the ABC was not aware of it. Until one day I saw the lead actor when it was driving a mission beat van, which is a van that picks up the intoxicated, the mentally ill, and finds them places for safety, medical attention, and rest in the city. But I saw the lead actor running into Town Hall Station one Friday afternoon, pulled that van up and chased him and demanded, did you act in a TV show called Wangina? So pop this up and tell us about your relationship with this odd TV show from 1966 in Australia, which actually spoke a lot about this law and even about elongated skulls, which I know are predominant in South America. Archaeologically, did the Indigenous population have elongated skulls in their past recovery of history? Are there elongated skulls?
Look, there's plenty across Australia and in the Pacific as well. And God, the stories of what the Wandjina is actually depicting are just the same as those ones, the engravings before I was talking about. I mean, there are knowledge holders who do know, and they choose not to tell those stories because they really don't want to freak people out. In a sense, the Wandjinas don't have mouths because you're not meant to be speaking their name. We're not using the right name, so I think we're okay now. But there's the headdresses that they're wearing, the deeper connection. When you actually look at the over 25,000 years of those rock paintings, there's this progression from a far more advanced society where they're wearing different sort of different types of headdresses, down to this final one, which is the Wandjina. And essentially, from what I know, the Wandjina are rain spirits. They're harking back to that great flood stories and different things like that in that sense, because they're certainly something that you wouldn't break back into the real world through saying the wrong name or different thing like that, because that's why they've lasted out there in the elements for more than 25,000 years in some cases. I mean, that's some of the oldest versions of the Wandjina. And they're still staying there today, despite all that sort of mining and the pastoral expansion in northwestern Australia. I mean, half the world's steel is dug up out of the ground in Western Australia there. God knows what sort of things they're disturbing there. And when they destroyed Cook and George a couple of years ago, you really wonder if there was something nefarious going on there and wanting to destroy that on behalf of that international mining company who did it. Those landscapes where the Wandjina live, the stories of the Wandjinas actually painted themselves on the wall through walking into the rock. If you ask the artists up there these days, no one painted the Wandjina. The Wandjina were here, and then they walked back through the rock and left their residue on the surface of the rock in the form of the rock paintings.
Right.
So look, that's. Yeah, if we've got another hour, we could probably go into more elements of that. And I think, there was a different era when those people were wanting to tell those stories through TV shows like that program. But yeah, it just hasn't, it's that willful forgetting that seems to happen so regularly in Australia too, that we don't, ethically or respectfully tell those stories properly.
And these ideas, these fragments of these ideas get shattered and exploited, but they're lying there. The elements of them are lying there in popular culture.
Yeah, they are.
And that was one of the first ever television appearances of our latter-day Academy Award-winning actress, and her name's
Jackie Weaver.
Jackie Weaver.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And we've been pushing for the ABC to put that out there. I think there may be a couple of episodes on YouTube for people to have a look at. And there is the sister program, which is The Stranger, but does not really deal with Indigenous culture.
Yeah, it's different.
Matt, I would love to speak to you for much longer.
I need to ask Matt a little, because he was in the museums. Now, have you ever been down in the basement of the museum and found the upas? Have you found any
out-of-place artifacts? Can you let us in on that?
Well, I want to keep my job.
Artifacts that affect the timeline.
Yeah, that they hide. They never show us. Hey?
Often they're hidden through mislabeling. That's the thing. Maybe when you've been in a museum, you've seen something that's out in plain sight that was just mislabeled. No, I've got my museum hat on still, and I'm keeping my job there for a little bit more. But,
Don't let Jay Katz and Aspersia wreck that for you. I would love to do another podcast with you. I know your time is valuable, and we really appreciate your knowledge, your academic wealth, and your ability to communicate to the non-academic, and just your graciousness and your beautiful soul. We totally respect that. We would love to get you back on the podcast in the future. I hope you're going to say okay. And thank you so much for your time today on the Untold Radio Network, part of Down South Anomalies.
Wow, it's just been so special talking to you both. I always love catching up, and please, anytime, reach out. And please, if anyone contacts, just share my email or contact. I'd be happy to chat to any of your audience too. Thank you so much for inviting me on, though.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure.
I mean, if there's any really important finds that you come up with, you need to break them on this program.
Okay. I'll look forward to that.
Almost.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay,
You take very good care, and our heart is with you. And thank you so much for your time today. You've been on the Untold Radio Network, and this is Down South Anomalies.
That is Down South Anomalies. Yeah.
That is. Thanks, Miss Steph.
All right.
I mean, Aspersia. What am I saying?
Yeah, don't say Miss Steph.
No,
yeah.
that's your stage name.
Yeah, it is.
All right. See you soon, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate it. And we will be back next week with another fascinating show, I'm sure.